TelecomTV, where ICT connects.
Hello, you're watching TelecomTV. I'm Martyn Warwick. We're here at the SDN and OpenFlow World Congress in Bad Homburg in Germany, not far from Frankfurt. And I'm talking with Tom Nolle, who is the boss of, the president of CIMI Corporation. Tom, you're the architect behind Cloud NFV. What is it? Tell us about it, please.
Sure. Well, Cloud NFV is, at least in the way that it was initiated, is a proof of concept demonstration of the utility of the ETSI NFV specifications, the specifications that are now developing. And it really came about because standards authoring does not create software. And unfortunately, or fortunately for us as an industry, Cloud NFV and NFV are both about a transformation of networking more in a software direction. So it was important to bring implementation experience and the real-world opportunity to test hypotheses that can be written easily and may be hard to do in some kind of a reliable framework. And so we started off with the notion of doing exactly that, testing everything out, making sure that what was written could actually be developed and deployed.
Thank you. Why does Cloud NFV matter in the greater scheme of things?
Well, I think the answer to that is that if you wanted to actually, for example, build a city, you can write a lot of blueprints and you can have wonderful drawings and prototypes and everything like that. But until engineers start erecting steel skeletons and slapping concrete on it and putting windows and plumbing and everything like that into place, nobody can really live there. If we want the vision of the network of the future to actually affect our lives in any meaningful way, we have to build the network. And in order to build the network, and in order to build a network of the kind that NFV mandates, we're going to have to completely transform the way that we think about almost everything in the networking space. And that kind of transformation is too complicated for anyone to grasp in abstract. You can't go to an operations person or to a telephone lineman or to a network operations center specialist and a service provider and tell them abstractly what this is going to mean and have them infer what it means to their jobs and what it means to the success of their particular function in the company. You have to show them. And so that's why it's important. We have to show these people. We have to demonstrate this to validate its utility, to validate its operations, and to make the business case for this, or it'll never matter.
Okay, thank you. Interesting as well. Look, the other thing about Cloud NFV is the fact that it's novel in a different way because people who've been working on it aren't the usual suspects, are they? No,
they're not. And that was actually deliberate. When Cloud NFV was launched, which was in November of last year, one of the things that was very clear from the descriptions that the operators provided in their initial call for action for the industry was that they were trying to move beyond a network that was controlled by a small number of very large vendors. They were wanting to move to something that was more like the open ecosystem of the Internet. And pretty clearly, if you start something off with that goal and you launch it based on the participation of the very people that you're trying to marginalize, it's not going to be particularly successful. No. So we actually had a rule that said no major network vendor will be permitted to be a part of the original group. And we picked as our large companies to be involved, companies like Dell, that had no real network association whatsoever. They were IT companies because this is an IT problem. We're trying to do things with computers that we used to do with specialized network devices. And so all of the people who are in this are people who are specialists in one of the functional areas, but none of them are stakeholders in the current network industry.
Now, that's really interesting. What has been the result of having that a different type of group of players being involved? Can you tell what has changed materially because of it?
Sure. The thing that's the most different is that when we've looked at the network of the future in all of the past efforts, and I've been involved in a large number of them, what we've ended up doing is coming up with a new way of doing the same thing that we've done all along. And so if we apply software technology to network problems in such a way as to generate hypothetically all kinds of new flexibility and new services and new opportunities. And then when we build it, we build virtual versions of the same physical devices that we already have. How many changes are we really going to see? The answer, none. So by putting the group that we had together, we were able to get people who weren't threatened by the transformation that the NFV vision demands. We were able to get people who would look at every aspect of the problem set, all the way from the underlying hardware to the high-level organizing software, completely freshly, because they didn't have the preconceptions that other people would have had. And so we were never bound by the past in the way that we looked at this.
You said that it's an IT problem, and indeed it is, but the industry is trying to not push it onto, but to get telcos and service providers in the telecommunications space to accept this. Are they doing that?
I think my perception is actually it's the other way around, which is the telecommunication service providers are trying to get the equipment vendors to accept it. I've talked to almost all of the operators here that are members of the process and founders of the original ISG work. And what I found there was a universal commitment to change and a fear that that commitment was going to be stymied in some way by the inertia of the current environment. And I think historically that's been true. The standards practices that have driven us in the past have always ended up reproducing what we had before.
True.
And I think they're concerned about that happening. I don't think they're in any way reluctant to make changes. They're just doubtful that we're going to be able to do it because we may not be able to get the support that we need to make it happen.
Very interesting you should say that, because the perceived version of events is that telcos tend to be very slow-moving for very obvious reasons. A network is a weighty animal, and you have to be very, very careful with the way you treat it. And so they've been reluctant, and perhaps the culture within telcos it's inbuilt that they're slow to do that sort of thing. But I've not heard the counter-argument that you've just given, that it's the vendors that are dragging the feet rather than the telcos. Why?
Well, I think a lot of it is, if you look at the telco side of this, the problem that they have is that the assets that they purchase to build networks have a presumed depreciation cycle, a useful life of about 7 years. So if you visualize building a network from a telco perspective, what you're doing is you're driving a big stick into the ground 7 years deep and then tying yourself to it. Because all of that infrastructure is going to have to stay around until the end of its useful life, or you're going to have to take a prodigious financial hit when you write it off. So they're concerned about obsolescence. But if you look at this from an equipment vendor's perspective, you've built your company. You've spent 10 years, 20 years, 30 years building your company selling widgets. And now someone comes along and says, you know what, we're going to go with virtual widgets instead of real widgets. Well, you don't make virtual widgets. So you're probably not rushing out to fulfill their fantasy. and therein lies the difficulty, and particularly now in America with the changes in financial regulations that came in after the last bubble, Sarbanes-Oxley. Every company is focused on their feet. They're focused on what's going to happen in their next financial quarter. And that doesn't contribute to the ability to think strategically. You're trying to make your numbers, and you don't make your numbers by telling your buyer that there's going to be a revolution in technology, and maybe they should wait a while before they buy any more product to see how it shakes out. And so there's the conservatism that's created by this short financial horizon is more of an effect on the industry than the conservatism that's created by the telco's concerns over obsoleting existing infrastructure.
Interesting you should say that. A couple of years ago, I was out for dinner with a couple of service providers, telcos in the States, off the record completely. It was just an evening meal, and we were chatting away, and as the brandy was swigged at the end of the meal, things relaxed a bit, and one of the guys said to me, no names, no pact, and he said, you know, Martyn, he said, the worst thing about this job and the worst thing about everything that's going on is the tyranny of quarterly reporting. I cannot lift my head above my desk to look down the road because it's always here I'm looking.
Exactly. And that issue, I think, is underrated in terms of its effect on technology evolution. If you think about what we've accomplished in technology over the last 10 years, one of the things that I think is striking, maybe even arresting about that, is that the focus of technology advancement has been on the consumer. And it's facile to say that the reason for that is there's a lot of consumers, and obviously if you can sell something to one, you're going to make a lot of money. But the real reason is the consumer doesn't have financial write-down, return on investment constraints. If the next iPhone is cooler than the current iPhone, they throw the old one away and get a new one.
Yeah.
There isn't any concept of any kind of enduring utility to these devices. But businesses can't operate that way. They have to operate based on the financial constraints that are set by the public corporate environment. And one of those constraints is I got to look good in the next quarterly report or my stock gets trashed. So we've created a financial impediment to industry advancing that didn't exist before. Before the Sarbanes-Oxley rules in the U.S. and corresponding regulations in the European Union and the other parts of the world, companies could be valued by their forward thinking. Now, if we try to value something by their forward thinking, the Securities and Exchange Commission says it's a bubble and they send us to jail. So this doesn't encourage innovation. And so what we see now is more and more being done by private companies that are not yet public, who are then acquired by the public companies at the proper moment in the cycle for the purposes of making the revolution legitimate. But they can only do that when it proves itself out. And that circles back to the question of why do we have to do prototypes? Because if we don't do prototypes, we'll never be able to prove to anyone there is a value to this, and no one will ever take the risk of deploying it, because some big company is going to have to get behind NFV as a vendor and supply the solutions, because the operators are not going to do what we did in Cloud NFV and take a half a dozen players that they've perhaps heard of in some cases, in other cases perhaps never heard of at all, and let them somehow fuse together as a happy band of brothers to put their network of the future into place. They're going to want some big giant player who, if it doesn't work, they can sue. Suing me is not going to help them. So I think that's one of the issues here. We had to fight our way through those kind of hurdles to make the network of the future real.
One final question. We brought it back around to NFV. What was it about Project Clearwater that made it so interesting as a first application for Cloud NFV?
The actual truth is that Project Clearwater is probably the only thing that you could do a prototype of NFV on that exists in the marketplace today. And that's one of the other interesting factors. If you're going to virtualize network functions, meaning that you're going to make something that's currently an appliance into software, and you expect that software to be more agile and more flexible and more operationalizable than the original device was, that software is going to have to be written for agility and flexibility. Why would I do that if I was going to put it inside a fixed box and stick it on a shelf? So the code that exists today, the software that exists today to perform network functions wasn't designed to be any of the things that NFV wants software of the future to be. And when we looked through this process, we could find only one vendor in the whole industry that had created software that was actually prepared for an NFV solution, and that was Metaswitch with Project Clearwater. Its software has the attributes that the requirements of the ETSI ISG are currently mandating. We can meet those requirements with Clearwater. We can't meet them with anything else. Now, over time, other people will write it this way. They're not writing it now because it's not clear to most software developers that these requirements are real. They're going to become real. They weren't real yet. They were real for Metaswitch, and they stepped out on that and took a lead in that area. And because they also were implementing the most important single use case for ISG on NFV functionality, which was IMS, it was the perfect fit. It wasn't the easiest thing to do, but it was the best thing to do.
Tom Nolle, that was interesting, insightful, and amusing. So thank you very much indeed.
It's my pleasure.
TelecomTV, where ICT connects.